At 2:47 a.m., when the phone rang, David Blackstone automatically assumed it was a business emergency, just like he had for the past 10 years. But the voice on the other end was a desperate whisper from a small child that would stop his cold heart. "Please, my mom is in the hospital and I'm only 8 years old." The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of David Blackstone's penthouse office, each drop like percussion against the glass that separated him from the world below. At 38, David had built Blackstone Properties into the most powerful real estate empire on the East Coast. His name was synonymous with luxury developments, commercial complexes that reshaped city skylines, and residential projects that only the wealthy could afford. Tonight, like every night for the past decade, David sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing acquisition reports. The blue glow of multiple monitors illuminated his sharp features, a face that had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune magazines, always wearing the same controlled expression that revealed nothing of the man beneath. "Sir, the Singapore investors confirmed the meeting for Thursday," his assistant Rachel had said before leaving at midnight. "The contracts for the Manhattan project are on your desk for final review." David nodded without looking up. Relationships were transactions. People were assets or liabilities. Emotions were weaknesses that clouded judgment. This philosophy had served him well since Sarah Chen. Even thinking her name after all these years created an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. 10 years ago, she had been the one person who'd managed to crack through his carefully constructed barriers. A brilliant architect with dreams of designing affordable housing, Sarah had seen potential in David beyond his growing wealth. "You're building walls instead of bridges," she had told him during their last argument. "When you're ready to let someone in, really in, call me." He never called. The memory was interrupted by the sharp ring of his private phone, the number only a handful of people possessed. David glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Probably the Tokyo office with an urgent update. "Blackstone," he answered curtly, eyes still scanning the Singapore proposal. Instead of the crisp, professional voice he expected, he heard something that made him freeze, a child crying. "Hello? Hello, is someone there?" came a small, trembling voice. David straightened in his chair. "You have the wrong number." "Please don't hang up," the voice pleaded, desperation cutting through the static. I can't reach anyone else. My mom is in the hospital and I'm only 8 years old." Something in the child's voice, pure terror mixed with forced bravery, penetrated David's usual defenses. "Where are your parents? Other family?" "It's just me and Mom," the boy said, his voice steadying slightly now that someone was listening. "She collapsed at work tonight. The ambulance came and they said she might not." The sentence dissolved into quiet sobs. David found himself leaning forward, his business documents forgotten. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the boy whispered. "Tommy Chen." The surname hit David like a physical blow. Chen. It couldn't be coincidence. "Tommy, where exactly are you right now?" "St. Mary's Hospital. They put me in a room with toys, but I'm scared. Mom won't wake up and I don't know what to do." David's mind raced. "Tommy, what's your mother's first name?" "Sarah," the boy replied immediately. "Sarah Chen. She draws buildings. Really pretty ones." The world tilted beneath David's feet. Sarah. His Sarah. The woman he'd loved and lost through his own stubborn pride. After 10 years of silence, her son was calling him in the middle of the night. "Tommy," David said, his voice gentler than it had been in years, "I'm coming to get you. Stay exactly where you are." David's hand shook as he grabbed his keys. He couldn't remember the last time he'd driven himself anywhere. His chauffeur handled transportation while David worked in the back seat. But tonight, he needed to be in control. The streets were empty except for the occasional taxi. David pushed his Bentley through the rain-slicked roads, his mind spinning with questions. Why did Tommy call his number? How did an 8-year-old even have access to it? And most importantly, was Tommy his son? The timeline fit. 10 years ago, Just before their final breakup, he and Sarah had been closer than ever. They talked about marriage, about the family they might build together. Then the Singapore deal had come along, his chance to expand internationally. He'd become obsessed, working 18-hour days, canceling dinners, missing important moments. "I feel like I'm competing with your ambition for your attention," Sarah had said during one of their last conversations. "And I'm losing." David had chosen his empire over love. Had Sarah been pregnant when he walked away? Had she tried to tell him and he'd been too busy to listen? St. Mary's Hospital appeared through the rain, its emergency lights cutting through the darkness. David parked haphazardly and ran toward the entrance, his expensive Italian shoes slipping on the wet pavement. The pediatric ward was quiet at 3 a.m. A tired-looking nurse directed David to the family waiting area, where he found a small boy huddled in a chair that dwarfed his tiny frame. Tommy Chin looked exactly like David had at that age, the same dark hair, the same determined jawline, the same green eyes that seemed too old for his face. But there was something else, something achingly familiar in the boy's expressions that spoke of Sarah's gentle nature. "Tommy?" David called softly. The boy looked up, and David saw his own face reflected in those familiar features. "Are you the man I called?" "Yes, I'm David. David Blackstone." Tommy steadied him with unsettling directness. "You know my mom, don't you? When I found your number in her phone, there was a heart emoji next to your name." David's throat tightened. After all these years, Sarah still had his number saved with a heart. "Yes, I knew your mother. We were very close friends. She talks about you sometimes," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "She says you build really tall buildings and that you're very important. She also says you were the one who got away." The phrase hit David like a sledgehammer. He sat down beside Tommy, struggling to process the emotions flooding through him. "How is she?" "Your mother?" Tommy's brave facade cracked slightly. "The doctors won't tell me much because I'm just a kid. They keep saying we're doing everything we can, but I know that's what adults say when things are really bad." David placed a tentative hand on the boy's shoulder. "Would you like me to talk to the doctors? Find out what's really happening?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "Please. I need to know if my mom is going to be okay." Dr. Martinez found them in the waiting room an hour later. Her expression was carefully controlled, but David recognized the look. He'd seen it in boardrooms when deals fell through. "Mr. Blackstone? I understand you're here about Sarah Chen." "I'm a family friend," David said carefully. "Tommy called me when he couldn't reach anyone else." Dr. Martinez glanced at Tommy, then back at David. "Could we speak privately?" David's heart sank. "Tommy, would you mind waiting here for just a minute? I'm going to talk to the doctor about your mom." In the hallway, Dr. Martinez delivered the news with professional compassion. Sarah suffered a massive stroke. The bleeding in her brain was extensive. "We've done everything medically possible, but she's not going to wake up, Mr. Blackstone. We're keeping her comfortable, but it's just a matter of time now. Hours, maybe a day at most." David leaned against the wall, overwhelmed. "Does Tommy know?" "We haven't told him the extent of it. He's just a child, and frankly, we've been trying to reach other family members. Child services will need to be involved if there's no next of kin." "There is," David said quietly. "There's me." David returned to find Tommy drawing in a coloring book someone had given him. The boy looked up hopefully. "What did the doctor say?" David sat down heavily, unsure how to deliver devastating news to a child. "Tommy, your mom is very sick. The doctors are taking good care of her, but she's dying, isn't she?" Tommy said with startling clarity. "I heard the nurses talking. They said brain dead and something about machines." David was stunned by the boy's directness. "Yes. I'm so sorry, Tommy." Tommy nodded solemnly, tears streaming down his face but his voice steady. "I knew when she fell down. She looked different. like she was already going somewhere else. David felt his own eyes fill with tears, something that hadn't happened in over a decade. "Tommy, is there anyone else? Grandparents? Aunts or uncles?" The boy shook his head. "It's always been just me and Mom. She said my dad was a good man who just wasn't ready to be a dad yet. She said maybe someday he'd be ready." The implication hung between them. David studied Tommy's face again, seeing more of himself with each passing moment. "Tommy, did your mom ever tell you anything else about your father?" "Sometimes she'd say I had his stubborn streak," Tommy said with a watery smile. "And that I think too much, just like him. She said he builds things because he's trying to build something perfect enough to make up for what he thinks he's missing inside." The description was so accurate it took David's breath away. Sarah had always seen through his defenses, understood the driven, lonely boy beneath the successful man. "Tommy," David said carefully, "how would you feel about taking a DNA test? It's just a simple cheek swab that could tell us if we're related." Tommy looked at him with those two knowing eyes. "You think you might be my dad?" "I think it's possible. Your mom and I, we cared about each other very much." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. "Then, if you are my dad, where have you been?" It was the question David had been dreading. "I made a terrible mistake. I chose work over the people I loved. I thought I could always fix things later, but later never came." "But you're here now," Tommy observed. "Yes. I'm here now." The DNA test was expedited, one advantage of David's connections and willingness to pay premium fees. While they waited for results, David stayed at the hospital, afraid to leave Tommy alone. They spent the afternoon in Sarah's room. She looked peaceful, connected to the machines that were keeping her body functioning while her brain slowly shut down. Tommy held her hand and told her about his school, his friends, his dreams of becoming an architect like her someday. "She taught me to see buildings as more than just structures," Tommy explained to David. "She said every building tells a story about the people who made it and the people who live in it." "What story do your buildings tell?" David had never considered the question. His buildings were monuments to his success, statements of power and wealth. "I'm not sure they tell good stories," he admitted. "Maybe you could start telling better ones." As evening approached, Dr. Martinez returned with the DNA results. David already knew what they would say. He could see it in Tommy's features, hear it in his way of thinking, feel it in the bond that had formed between them in just one day. "The test confirms it," Dr. Martinez said quietly. "Tommy is your son." David closed his eyes, a decade of regret washing over him. He was a father. Had been a father for 8 years without knowing it. All those birthdays missed, those first words never heard, those scraped knees he hadn't been there to bandage. "Tommy," he said, kneeling beside the boy's chair. "The test shows that I am your father." Tommy nodded as if he'd already known. "Are you angry that Mom didn't tell you?" "No," David said, surprising himself with the honesty. "I'm angry at myself for not being the kind of man she felt she could tell." That night, Sarah's machines were turned off. David held Tommy as his son said goodbye to the only parent he'd ever known. Through his grief, Tommy was remarkably composed, whispering promises to his mother that he'd be brave and that he'd found his dad, just like she'd always hoped he would. The funeral was small. Sarah had lived quietly, and her circle of friends was close but not large. David found himself meeting the woman who had been his son's world for 8 years through the eyes of people who loved her. "Sarah always said Tommy's father would come back when he was ready," said Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah's neighbor who had watched Tommy after school. "She never gave up hope that you'd find each other." David learned that Sarah had built a successful architectural practice specializing in affordable housing, the dream she'd shared with him years ago. She'd won awards for her innovative designs that brought beauty and dignity to low-income communities. She'd raised Tommy alone but had surrounded him with love and stability. She never dated anyone seriously, confided her business partner, Elena. She said she'd had her great love and was content to focus on Tommy and her work. Each revelation about Sarah's life made David's guilt deeper. She had deserved so much more than he'd given her. Taking Tommy home to his penthouse was surreal. The sterile, modern space suddenly felt inadequate for a grieving 8-year-old who needed comfort and warmth. "This is where you live?" Tommy asked, taking in the minimalist decor and expensive art. "It's where I've been staying," David corrected. "But now it's where we live. Would you like to pick out a room?" Tommy chose the bedroom with the best view of the city skyline. "Mom would have loved this view," he said softly. Over the following weeks, David tried to learn how to be a father while managing his business empire. It was the most challenging project he'd ever undertaken. Tommy needed help with homework, comfort during nightmares, and answers to impossible questions about grief and loss. "Why didn't you want me before?" Tommy asked one evening over dinner. David set down his fork, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "I didn't know you existed, Tommy. But even if I had, I'm not sure I would have been a good father then. I was too selfish, too focused on work. And now? Now I want to learn how to be the father you deserve." Tommy considered this. "Mom used to say that people can change if they really want to. Do you really want to?" "More than anything." David's life underwent a radical transformation. 18-hour workdays became 8-hour days with evenings dedicated to Tommy. Business trips were rescheduled or handled remotely. The Singapore deal, once his obsession, was delegated to his capable team. Tommy attended a private school near David's office, allowing for easy pickup and drop-off. David found himself joining other parents at school events, learning the social dynamics of playground politics and parent-teacher conferences. Mr. Blackstone, Tommy's teacher, Ms. Patterson, said during their first conference, "Tommy is an exceptional child. Gifted academically but also emotionally mature for his age. However, he's carrying a lot of grief. Have you considered counseling?" David and Tommy began attending family therapy sessions with Dr. Williams, a gentlewoman who specialized in trauma and loss. In those sessions, David confronted his own emotional limitations while helping Tommy process his grief. "Tommy feels responsible for taking care of everyone's feelings," Dr. Williams explained to David privately. "He's been protecting his mother's memory and your feelings while dealing with his own loss. He needs permission to just be a kid." David began to understand that being a father meant more than providing financial security. Tommy needed emotional availability, consistency, and most importantly, the space to grieve and heal. Slowly, their relationship deepened. Tommy began calling him Dad instead of David. They established bedtime routines, weekend adventures, and inside jokes. David discovered the joy of seeing the world through a child's eyes, the wonder at architectural details he'd never noticed, the excitement over simple pleasures like ice cream and movies. 3 months after Sarah's death, David's assistant announced an unexpected visitor, Elena Vasquez, Sarah's business partner. "Mr. Blackstone," Elena said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced. I wanted to talk to you about Sarah's practice." David had been dreading this conversation. Sarah's architectural firm would need to be dissolved, her projects transferred or abandoned. "I've been handling the transition of her clients," Elena continued. "But there's something you should know." Sarah left detailed instructions about her practice. She wanted it to continue. Elena placed a folder on David's desk. "She left the firm to Tommy, with you as trustee until he comes of age. But more than that, she left a letter." David opened the envelope with trembling hands. Sarah's familiar handwriting filled the pages. "David, if you're reading this, it means 2 things: I'm gone, and you've found Tommy. I always believed you would, somehow. I never told you about Tommy because you weren't ready. The man I fell in love with was buried under ambition and fear. You needed to find your way back to yourself before you could be the father our son deserves. I don't blame you for choosing your career over our relationship. I knew who you were when I fell in love with you. But I also saw who you could become. Tommy has that same potential, brilliant, driven, but capable of great love if he learns to balance achievement with connection. I've left my practice to him because I want him to understand that buildings aren't just structures, they're homes for human dreams. Teach him that success without purpose is just expensive emptiness. Love him enough for both of us. He's the best parts of each of us. With love and forgiveness. Sarah. P.S. I kept your number all these years because I never stopped hoping you'd call. I'm glad you finally found your way to us, even if it took a wrong number to make it happen. David read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Sarah had forgiven him, believed in him, and given him the chance to become the man she'd always seen in him. That evening, David sat with Tommy on their balcony, watching the city lights twinkle below. In his hands was Sarah's letter. "Mom left you something," David said, handing Tommy the letter. Tommy read it slowly, his lips moving slightly with the words. When he finished, he was quiet for a long time. "She really did believe you'd come back," Tommy said finally. "She believed in the better version of me before I even knew it existed." Tommy leaned against David's shoulder. "Maybe that's what love is, seeing who someone could become and helping them get there." David smiled at his son's wisdom. "Your mother was very smart. So are you, Dad. You just had to learn different kinds of smart." Over the following months, David made a decision that surprised everyone in his business circle. He restructured Blackstone Properties to include a division focused on affordable housing, continuing Sarah's work with the resources to make a massive impact. "You're walking away from millions in profit," his CFO warned during the board meeting where David announced the new direction. "I'm walking towards something more valuable," David replied, thinking of Tommy's proud smile when he'd explained the new company mission. The first project was a mixed-income development that combined luxury units with affordable housing, creating diverse communities rather than isolated wealth. David insisted that Sarah's architectural firm, now under Elena's management with Tommy as the future inheritor, design the project. 1 year after that fateful phone call, David stood with Tommy at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Sarah Chin Memorial Community Center, the cornerstone of their first inclusive development. "Your mother would be so proud," David told Tommy as they watched families move into their new homes, some in the affordable units, others in the luxury spaces, all part of the same community. Tommy, now 9 and somehow even wiser, looked up at his father. "I think she is proud. And I think she's happy we found each other." David hugged his son, marveling at how one wrong number had led to the most right thing in his life. He thought about the man he'd been just a year ago, isolated, driven by empty achievements, building walls instead of bridges. Now he was building something different, a relationship with his son, a company with purpose, and communities that brought people together rather than keeping them apart. "Dad," Tommy said as they walked toward their car, "I've been thinking about what I want to be when I grow up." "Oh? Still an architect like Mom?" "Maybe. But I think I want to be like both of you. Build things that matter and be there for the people I love." David stopped walking, overwhelmed by the perfection of that statement. His son had inherited the best of both parents, Sarah's compassionate vision and David's determination, but with the wisdom to balance them. "That sounds perfect," David said, his voice thick with emotion. As they drove home through the city that David's buildings had helped shape, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A wrong number had become the right call. A lost love had led to found family. And a man who had built an empire of stone and steel had learned to build something far more valuable, a life filled with love. 5 years later, David Blackstone, now known as much for his philanthropic work as his business success, sat in his office reviewing plans for the 10th Sarah Chin Memorial Community. At 43, he looked different than he had that night when Tommy first called. The lines around his eyes came from laughter now, not stress. His success was measured not just in dollars but in lives changed and communities built. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Tommy, now 13 and already showing talent for architectural design, stood in the doorway holding his phone. "Dad, I just got the weirdest call. Some kid who says he's lost and scared. He dialed a random number and got me." David smiled, remembering another scared child who had dialed a random number on a dark night. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was coming to help," Tommy said simply. Is that okay? David stood, reaching for his coat. It's perfect. Let's go. As they left the office together, David thought about how one wrong number had taught them both that sometimes the most important calls are the ones we never expected to receive. And sometimes, helping a stranger in need is just love calling from an unexpected number. The real estate mogul who had once built walls around his heart now spent his life building bridges between communities, between people, and between the man he had been and the father he had become. All because an 8-year-old boy had dialed the wrong number on the most right night of their lives. Sometimes the wrong number leads you to exactly where you need to be.